My name is David, and I'm 62 years old now, living quietly in a small town outside Denver, Colorado. For most of my adult life, I carried a secret that weighed heavier than any burden I thought possible. Today, I want to share something with you that I've never spoken about publicly before. Something that happened behind the perfect facade of what everyone believed was an exemplary Jehovah's Witness family. If you're watching this and you've lived through something similar, I want you to know from the start that you're not alone. And what happened in our home was not normal, no matter what anyone told you about submission, headship, or keeping peace in the congregation. I was born in 1962 in a modest two-bedroom house in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona. My father, Robert, was 34 when I came into this world, already climbing the ranks within the local Kingdom Hall congregation. My mother, Sarah, was just 26, a quiet woman with gentle brown eyes who had converted to the faith 2 years before meeting my father. She often told me how she thought she had found the truth, the real way to serve God, and how grateful she felt to have been chosen by such a spiritually strong man. What I didn't understand then, and what took me decades to fully comprehend, was how that gratitude would become a prison that trapped her for over 40 years. Our house on Maple Street looked like any other suburban home from the outside. Neat lawn, white picket fence, flower beds that my mother tended with obsessive care because appearances mattered so much in our world. Inside, everything was organized with military precision. Books from the Watchtower Society lined our shelves, meeting bags sat by the front door, ready for Tuesday and Thursday nights, and Sunday mornings began before dawn with family Bible study. To anyone who visited, we appeared to be the model Jehovah's Witness family that every couple in the congregation aspired to become. My father was appointed as a ministerial servant when I was just 3 years old, and by the time I turned 7, he had been elevated to elder status. I remember the night of his appointment clearly because it was one of the few times I saw genuine joy on my mother's face. She prepared his favorite meal, pressed his best suit, and spoke with pride about how Jehovah was blessing our family through my father's spiritual advancement. What she didn't know, what none of us could have predicted, was how that position would transform him from the man who had courted her with flowers and gentle words into someone who wielded spiritual authority like a weapon. The changes began subtly, so gradually that even now I struggle to pinpoint exactly when the shift occurred. My father started correcting my mother more frequently, not just privately, but in front of other congregation members. During family Bible study, he would interrupt her answers, telling her she needed to think more clearly about what the Bible really taught. When she tried to express her own understanding of a scripture, he would shake his head and explain why her interpretation showed a lack of spiritual maturity. I watched her withdraw little by little, her contributions becoming shorter, her smiles more forced, her natural curiosity about spiritual matters slowly extinguished under the weight of constant correction. As an elder, my father was now responsible for shepherding calls, judicial committees, and providing spiritual guidance to struggling families in the congregation. The irony was lost on me as a child, but it strikes me now how he could counsel other husbands about showing love and kindness to their wives while treating my mother with increasing coldness and control at home. He would return from these shepherding visits and criticize my mother for not having dinner ready at the exact time he expected, or for speaking too freely with the other sisters after meetings, or for showing what he called inappropriate interest in worldly matters when she asked about news she had heard on the radio. The doctrine of headship became his favorite teaching tool. According to the Watchtower publications we studied religiously, husbands were appointed by God to be the head of their households, and wives were to submit in all things as long as they weren't asked to violate God's laws. My father interpreted this mandate broadly, using it to control everything from what my mother wore to meetings to which sisters she could befriend, to how she disciplined me when he wasn't home. When she questioned any of his decisions, he would remind her that questioning his authority was questioning Jehovah's arrangement, and that rebellious wives brought shame not only on their families, but on the entire congregation. I learned to read the warning signs early. The tightness around my father's eyes when he came home from elder meetings meant that dinner conversation would be minimal, and any noise from me would be met with sharp correction. The way my mother's voice became smaller when other families visited meant that she was already anticipating criticism about something she had said or done. The forced brightness in her tone when she talked about our family's spiritual routine meant that she was overcompensating for something that had disappointed my father earlier that day. Our home became a stage where all three of us performed our roles as the perfect Jehovah's Witness family. But the performance was exhausting, and the cost was measured in my mother's tears and my growing confusion about what it really meant to serve God. By the time I was 10 years old, my father had become one of the most respected elders in our circuit. Other congregations would request him for special talks, and he was frequently chosen to serve on judicial committees when serious matters arose that required experienced spiritual shepherds. The prestige fed something in him that seemed to grow hungrier with each appointment, each commendation from the circuit overseer, each time newer elders sought his advice about handling difficult situations. At home, this translated into increasingly unrealistic expectations for both my mother and me. We were expected to be examples at all times, to never give anyone reason to question his qualifications as an elder or his ability to manage his own household according to biblical principles. My mother began to change in ways that frightened me. Though I didn't have the vocabulary then to understand what I was witnessing, she stopped singing the kingdom songs with the same enthusiasm, her voice barely audible even when we sat in the front rows. She started having what she called sick headaches that would keep her in bed for hours after we returned from meetings, lying in the dark with a washcloth over her eyes, while my father criticized her for not being strong enough to fulfill her responsibilities. She lost weight gradually but steadily, claiming she just wasn't hungry, but I noticed how she would push food around on her plate during family meals, while listening to my father's increasingly lengthy lectures about spiritual matters, congregation responsibilities, and the importance of maintaining our reputation as a family that other witnesses could look up to and admire. The conversations between my parents became stilted and formal, more like business meetings than exchanges between people who supposedly loved each other. My father would inform my mother about schedule changes, meeting assignments, or social gatherings we were expected to attend, and she would respond with quiet acknowledgement, rarely asking questions or offering her own thoughts about anything he shared. When she did try to contribute to discussions about congregation matters or share something she had learned in her personal Bible study, he would listen with barely concealed impatience and then redirect the conversation to what he considered more important or more accurately understood topics. I began to notice that my mother stopped talking about her own spiritual insights altogether, limiting her comments to practical matters about household management or my school activities, subjects that seemed safer and less likely to provoke correction or lengthy explanations about why her thinking needed adjustment. This became our new normal, a household where spiritual authority had morphed into something that felt more like control than love, where the very doctrines that were supposed to bring us closer to God had become tools for enforcing silence and submission. I was too young to understand the full implications of what I was witnessing, but old enough to sense that something fundamental was wrong with the way we lived compared to the way other families seemed to interact. Even other Jehovah's Witness families, where the fathers also served as elders, but somehow managed to treat their wives with visible affection and respect. The transformation in our household accelerated when I entered middle school. My father's influence within the congregation had grown significantly, and he was now serving on the hospital liaison committee, helping other Jehovah's Witnesses navigate medical situations while maintaining their refusal of blood transfusions. The responsibility seemed to inflate his sense of importance, and he began treating our home like an extension of his elder duties, complete with the same rigid hierarchy and unquestioning obedience he expected from congregation members who sought his spiritual guidance. My mother's silence became more pronounced during this period. Where she once might have offered gentle suggestions about family decisions or shared her thoughts about Bible readings during our morning worship, she now sat with her hands folded, responding only when directly asked questions that required simple yes or no answers. I watched her fade before my eyes, like a photograph left too long in sunlight, her vibrant personality dissolving under the constant pressure to conform to my father's increasingly narrow definition of what constituted proper wifely submission, according to Watchtower teachings. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine shepherding call. Brother Williams and his wife had been struggling with marital problems, and my father had been assigned to provide spiritual counsel along with another elder from our congregation. Instead of meeting at the Kingdom Hall as was customary, my father decided to invite them to our home, claiming it would provide a more comfortable environment for such a sensitive discussion. I was supposed to be asleep, but the raised voices in our living room kept me awake, and I found myself listening from the top of the stairs, trying to understand why adult conversations always seemed to involve so much tension and unhappiness. What I heard that night changed everything for me, though it would take years before I could fully process the implications. Brother Williams was defending his wife against accusations that she was being rebellious and failing to show proper respect for his headship. My father, speaking with the authority of his position, began explaining how wives needed to understand that questioning their husband's decisions was essentially questioning God's arrangement for the family. He used my mother as an example of proper submission, describing how she never challenged his decisions and always deferred to his judgment in all matters, both spiritual and practical. "Sarah understands her role," my father said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "She recognizes that when I speak as the head of this household, I'm representing Jehovah's authority. She doesn't burden me with doubts or complaints because she knows that undermines the very foundation of Christian marriage." I heard my mother make a small sound, something between a sigh and a whimper, but she said nothing to contradict his portrayal of their relationship. The silence that followed felt heavy and wrong, pregnant with unspoken truths that no one in that room was willing to acknowledge. After the Williams family left, I expected to hear my parents discuss what had happened, perhaps for my mother to express some thoughts about the situation they had just counseled. Instead, I heard my father criticizing my mother for fidgeting during his explanation of proper wifely conduct, telling her that her restlessness had been distracting and could have undermined his effectiveness as a counselor. He reminded her that as an elder's wife, she carried special responsibilities to set an example for other women in the congregation, and that any sign of disagreement or discomfort with his teaching could cause stumbling among those who looked to their family for spiritual guidance. School became my refuge during these years, the one place where I could observe normal family dynamics through my classmates' casual mentions of parents who discussed decisions together, mothers who expressed opinions without fear of correction, and households where disagreement didn't automatically translate into spiritual failure. I began to notice how different my mother seemed when my father wasn't present. During school events where only she attended, I would catch glimpses of the woman she might have been, laughing more freely with other mothers, expressing genuine interest in conversations that had nothing to do with congregation activities or spiritual matters. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. At Kingdom Hall meetings, my father would deliver talks about the importance of love in marriage, quoting scriptures about husbands cherishing their wives as their own bodies and treating them with honor as the weaker vessel. Other congregation members would nod approvingly, often commenting afterward about what a blessing it was to have such a spiritually mature elder providing guidance about family relationships. Meanwhile, our home life continued to deteriorate as my father's interpretation of biblical headship grew more controlling, and my mother's spirit seemed to shrink a little more each day. I started paying closer attention to my mother's daily routines, looking for clues about what was happening to her. She began spending longer periods in the bathroom, and I would sometimes hear muffled crying through the door, though she always emerged with composed expression and red-rimmed eyes that she attributed to allergies or tiredness. Her appetite continued to diminish, and she developed a habit of rearranging household items obsessively, as if having perfect organization might somehow prevent the next criticism or correction from my father. The most disturbing pattern involved my mother's interaction with other congregation members. During social gatherings, I noticed how she would position herself near other women but rarely contribute to conversations, instead nodding and smiling while others shared stories or expressed opinions about various topics. When someone directly asked her thoughts about something, she would glance toward my father before responding, and her answers became increasingly generic and non-committal. The vibrant woman who had once enjoyed discussing Bible topics and sharing experiences from the ministry had been replaced by someone who seemed terrified of saying the wrong thing or accidentally revealing thoughts that might conflict with her husband's positions on various matters. My teenage years brought new complications as I began to develop my own questions about the faith and the organization. Normal adolescent curiosity about the outside world was treated as spiritual weakness in our household, and any expression of doubt about Watchtower teachings was met with immediate correction and additional Bible study assignments designed to strengthen my appreciation for the truth we had been privileged to receive. I watched my mother during these family studies, seeing her flinch slightly whenever my questions pushed against the boundaries of acceptable inquiry, knowing that she would face criticism later for not properly preparing me to receive spiritual instruction without resistance. The turning point came when I was 16 and accidentally discovered a letter my mother had written but never sent. I'd been looking for school supplies in her bedroom dresser when I found the envelope hidden beneath some Watchtower magazines. My grandmother's address written in my mother's careful handwriting, but no postmark indicating it had ever been mailed. The letter was 3 pages long, written in pencil on lined paper, and reading it felt like discovering a secret diary that revealed thoughts my mother had never been allowed to express aloud. "Dear Mother," the letter began, "I know it's been months since I've written, but I hardly know what to say anymore. Robert says I spend too much time thinking about worldly family when I should be focused on spiritual family, but I miss you so much it feels like a physical ache sometimes. I know you don't understand our faith, and I know Robert thinks your influence might weaken my resolve. But there are days when I wish I could just talk to someone who remembers who I used to be before I learned to be so careful about everything I say and think and feel." Reading those words felt like discovering that my mother was still alive somewhere inside the quiet, submissive woman she had become. The letter continued for pages, describing feelings she had never expressed, and observations about our family life that she had apparently never felt safe sharing with anyone. She wrote about missing the person she used to be, about wondering if serving God was supposed to make people feel so small and afraid, about loving my father but feeling lost in the shadow of his spiritual authority. But you know what, my dear viewers, I need to pause here for just a moment. Sharing this story with you feels like opening an old wound, but it also feels necessary, like finally speaking truth that's been locked away too long. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own experience, I want you to know that your feelings are valid, your questions are important, and your pain deserves to be acknowledged. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply admit that something wasn't right, even when everyone around us insisted it was normal. I see you, I believe you, and I'm honored that you're trusting me with your time while I share what happened in our family. Your stories matter too, and I hope you'll feel comfortable sharing them in the comments below. We're building something here together, a community where truth doesn't have to hide behind perfect facades. The discovery of that unsent letter marked the beginning of my real awakening to what was happening in our house, but it also coincided with one of the darkest periods in my mother's life within the congregation. I was 17 when I witnessed something that still haunts me today. Something that showed me just how far my father was willing to use his position as an elder to maintain absolute control over every aspect of our family life, even when it meant twisting the very scriptures he claimed to uphold with such devotion. It started with what seemed like an innocent disagreement about a congregation social event. The sisters in our Kingdom Hall had organized a baby shower for a young mother in the congregation, and my mother had volunteered to help with the decorations and food preparation. She seemed genuinely excited about the project, more animated than I had seen her in months, and I remember thinking that this might be exactly what she needed to reconnect with the social aspects of our faith that had once brought her such joy and fulfillment. The problems began when my father learned that some of the sisters planned to include games and activities that he deemed inappropriate for Christians. Nothing scandalous or obviously worldly, just simple party games that involved guessing baby-related trivia and sharing funny stories about child-rearing experiences. In his view, these activities were too frivolous and bore too much resemblance to worldly celebration customs that faithful Jehovah's Witnesses should avoid. He instructed my mother to withdraw from the planning committee and suggested that she encourage the other sisters to modify their plans to focus more exclusively on scriptural discussions and spiritual encouragement for the expectant mother. My mother tried to present his concerns diplomatically to the other women, but they had already made significant preparations and saw no spiritual harm in the planned activities. Sister Martinez, who was coordinating the event, pointed out that similar gatherings had been held regularly in other congregations without any objections from the elders, and she suggested that perhaps my father had misunderstood the nature of what they were planning. She offered to meet with him directly to explain their intentions and address any specific concerns he might have about the appropriateness of their plans. This reasonable suggestion triggered something in my father that I had never witnessed before. When my mother relayed Sister Martinez's offer, his face darkened with an anger that seemed disproportionate to the situation. He accused my mother of undermining his authority by allowing other congregation members to question his spiritual judgment, and he demanded that she immediately withdraw from any involvement with the baby shower planning. When she hesitantly mentioned that the other sisters were counting on her help and might not understand her sudden withdrawal, he exploded with a fury that transformed our quiet living room into something that felt like a judicial committee meeting. "Sarah," he said, using the same authoritative tone I had heard him employ during congregation discipline meetings, "I need to determine whether you have a proper understanding of Christian submission and your role as an elder's wife. Your attitude in this matter suggests some serious spiritual confusion that needs to be addressed immediately." He instructed me to go to my room, but our house was small enough that I could hear every word of what followed, and what I heard was my father conducting a formal interrogation of my mother as if she were a congregation member being investigated for wrongdoing. He began by questioning her motives for wanting to participate in the baby shower, demanding that she examine whether her desires were motivated by proper Christian love or by selfish social interests that could compromise her spiritual priorities. He asked her to explain why she thought her judgment about appropriate Christian activities should carry any weight when it conflicted with his understanding of scriptural principles. He required her to articulate her understanding of the biblical arrangement of headship and to acknowledge specific ways that her attitude in this situation demonstrated a lack of proper submission to his authority as both her husband and a spiritual shepherd appointed by Jehovah's organization. The questioning continued for over 2 hours, with my father systematically breaking down every aspect of my mother's involvement in the baby shower planning, until she was sobbing and apologizing for what she called her prideful and rebellious attitude. He made her promise to contact Sister Martinez the next day, to withdraw completely from the event, and to explain that her husband had helped her see the spiritual dangers inherent in their plans. He required her to commit to being more careful in the future about accepting social invitations without first seeking his guidance, and to acknowledge that her willingness to question his concerns had revealed dangerous independent thinking that could lead to serious spiritual consequences if left unchecked. But the most devastating part came near the end of this interrogation, when my father told my mother that her behavior in this situation had caused him to question her qualifications as an elder's wife, and that he was considering whether he needed to discuss her spiritual condition with the other elders in our congregation. The threat was clear, even though he never stated it explicitly. If she continued to demonstrate what he characterized as a rebellious spirit, he would bring her before a judicial committee, where her standing in the congregation and possibly her marriage would be subject to review and potential discipline by men who had been trained to view wifely submission as a cornerstone of Christian faithfulness. I listened to my mother's desperate promises to do better, to be more submissive, to never again question his judgment about spiritual matters. I heard her voice break as she thanked him for his patience with her weaknesses and assured him that she understood how blessed she was to have a husband who cared enough about her spiritual welfare to correct her when she strayed from proper Christian thinking. The whole scene felt like watching someone confess to crimes she hadn't committed while praising the wisdom of her interrogator for helping her see the error of her ways. The aftermath was even worse than the confrontation itself. My mother withdrew, not just from the baby shower planning, but from nearly all social interaction with the other sisters in the congregation. She became hyper-vigilant about seeking my father's approval before expressing any opinion or making any commitment, no matter how minor. When congregation members asked why she had suddenly pulled out of the baby shower preparations, she dutifully repeated my father's concerns about maintaining proper spiritual focus, though I could see the shame in her eyes when she delivered these explanations that portrayed her as having been spiritually confused and in need of her husband's correction. The other elders in our congregation seemed to accept my father's handling of the situation without question, praising him for maintaining high spiritual standards in his household and for helping his wife develop a more mature understanding of Christian priorities. Some of the sisters even complimented my mother on her humility in accepting correction and adjusting her attitude to align more closely with theocratic principles. The whole congregation seemed to view the incident as evidence of my father's excellent spiritual leadership rather than as a troubling example of emotional and spiritual abuse disguised as biblical headship. During this period, I began to understand that what was happening in our home wasn't just about personality conflicts or marriage difficulties. My father had created a system where any disagreement with his decisions could be reframed as spiritual rebellion, where any expression of independent thought could be characterized as dangerous pride, and where any desire for normal human autonomy could be condemned as selfish disregard for God's arrangement of authority. He had weaponized the very doctrines that were supposed to promote love and unity in our family, turning them into tools for maintaining absolute control over my mother's thoughts, feelings, and behavior. I started paying attention to how other elder families in our congregation functioned, looking for signs that this kind of dynamic was normal within our faith community. What I discovered was more complicated than I had expected. Some elder families seemed to maintain healthier relationships, where wives expressed opinions freely and husbands consulted their spouses about important decisions. But others showed subtle signs of the same controlling patterns I was witnessing at home. Wives who seemed unusually quiet during congregation gatherings, husbands who corrected their spouses publicly over minor matters, families where the elder's spiritual authority seemed to extend into every aspect of household management and personal choice. The most disturbing realization was that the Watchtower literature itself provided justification for almost any level of control that a husband chose to exercise over his wife, as long as it was framed in terms of spiritual concern and biblical headship. Articles in the Watchtower and Awake magazines regularly reinforced the idea that questioning a husband's decisions was tantamount to questioning God's arrangement, that wives who expressed dissatisfaction with their marriages were probably struggling with prideful, independent thinking, and that the solution to marital problems invariably involved wives becoming more submissive rather than husbands becoming more loving or considerate. By the time I graduated from high school, I had begun to see our family situation with clearer eyes, though I still lacked the courage or knowledge to challenge what was happening directly. I could see that my mother was disappearing piece by piece, that her natural personality was being systematically suppressed in service of my father's interpretation of Christian marriage, and that the religion I had been raised in was providing both the justification and the framework for what I now recognize as sophisticated emotional and spiritual abuse carried out in the name of serving God faithfully. The tragedy was that everyone involved, including my mother herself, had been convinced that this destruction of her autonomous selfhood was not only acceptable, but spiritually commendable, a beautiful example of Christian submission that other wives should strive to emulate in their own marriages. My final 2 years of high school coincided with my father's appointment to the Circuit Assembly Program Committee, a position that required him to travel frequently throughout our region and work closely with circuit overseers in organizing the larger gatherings that brought multiple congregations together for spiritual instruction and encouragement. The increased responsibilities elevated his status within our local theocratic community, but they also intensified the pressure on our family to maintain an even more perfect facade of spiritual maturity and organizational loyalty. During this period, I began to notice patterns in my mother's behavior that I hadn't recognized before, subtle signs of the psychological toll that years of systematic control and correction had taken on her mental and emotional well-being. She developed what she called nervous habits, constantly checking and rechecking household tasks to ensure they met my father's exacting standards, reorganizing closets and cabinets multiple times until everything was arranged exactly as he preferred. Her sleep became irregular, and I would often hear her moving around the house late at night, cleaning things that were already clean, preparing for the next day with an anxiety that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker as time passed. The most heartbreaking change was in her relationship with personal Bible study and prayer, activities that had once been sources of genuine comfort and spiritual connection for her. I watched her approach these daily routines with increasing mechanical precision, reading assigned portions of Watchtower publications and rehearsing answers to study questions with the same careful attention she might give to memorizing a script for a performance. The spontaneous joy and curiosity about spiritual matters that had characterized her faith during my early childhood had been replaced by a fearful diligence aimed primarily at avoiding any interpretation or insight that might conflict with approved organizational teaching or my father's personal understanding of doctrinal points. The transformation became most apparent during family worship sessions, our weekly time set aside for Bible-based discussion and spiritual strengthening. What had once been interactive conversations where all three of us contributed thoughts and questions had evolved into lectures delivered by my father with my mother and me, serving as a captive audience whose primary role was to demonstrate proper attention and appreciation for his spiritual insights. When my mother did venture to offer comments or ask questions, she would preface them with phrases like, "I might be wrong about this," or "I'm probably not understanding this correctly." Disclaimers that revealed how thoroughly her confidence in her own spiritual discernment had been eroded. My father seemed to interpret these changes as evidence of my mother's spiritual growth rather than signs of psychological distress. He would commend her increased humility and willingness to accept correction, praising her development from what he characterized as her earlier tendency toward independent thinking into a mature appreciation for theocratic order and proper submission to appointed authority. When other elders commented on the positive changes they observed in our family dynamics, he would credit the effectiveness of consistent spiritual guidance and the importance of maintaining biblical standards in the home, regardless of how difficult such discipline might initially appear to worldly observers. The breaking point came during my senior year when my mother experienced what we now understand was a severe anxiety attack during a circuit assembly. We were sitting in our assigned seats in the convention center, listening to a talk about the importance of family unity in serving Jehovah, when my mother suddenly began hyperventilating and trembling uncontrollably. My father immediately attributed her distress to spiritual weakness or possibly demonic attack, and he insisted on taking her to a private area where he could pray with her and help her regain proper spiritual focus rather than seeking medical attention that might have addressed the underlying psychological factors contributing to her condition. I watched helplessly as my father conducted what amounted to an impromptu counseling session in a storage room behind the convention center kitchen, questioning my mother about sins she might be hiding or doubts she might be harboring that could have made her vulnerable to Satan's influence during such an important spiritual program. She sobbed and apologized repeatedly, promising to examine her heart more carefully and to increase her personal study and prayer to strengthen her resistance to negative spiritual influences. The whole scene felt like watching someone confess to imaginary crimes, while her actual suffering went completely unrecognized and unaddressed. The incident was never discussed openly after that day, but it marked the beginning of my serious questioning about whether what I was witnessing in our family actually represented the loving Christian relationships that our faith was supposed to produce. I began paying closer attention to the experiences of other congregation members, particularly women whose husbands held positions of responsibility within the organization, and I started to recognize subtle patterns of control and suppression that extended far beyond our individual family situation. Sister Johnson, whose husband served as the congregation secretary, had stopped participating in field service groups led by anyone other than her husband after he had criticized her for being too talkative with the other publishers. Sister Davis, married to our presiding overseer, had given up her part-time job at the local library because her husband decided that her exposure to worldly literature and secular colleagues was having a negative influence on her spiritual priorities. Sister Garcia had stopped attending the book study held at our house because her elder husband felt that she was developing inappropriate friendships with some of the other women in the group. Relationships that he characterized as potentially divisive to proper congregational unity. Each of these situations was presented and accepted within our congregation as evidence of spiritual maturity and proper submission to theocratic principles, but I began to see them as examples of systematic isolation and control that used religious authority to justify the gradual elimination of women's autonomy, friendships, and personal interests. The pattern was consistent. Any activity, relationship, or interest that provided women with sources of validation, intellectual stimulation, or emotional support outside of their immediate family structure was gradually identified as potentially dangerous and systematically discouraged or eliminated entirely. My mother's situation was perhaps the most extreme example I witnessed, but it wasn't fundamentally different from what was happening to many other women in our congregation whose husbands held positions of authority within the organization. The difference was mainly in degree and in my father's particular skill at using doctrinal arguments and spiritual pressure to enforce his control while maintaining the appearance of loving Christian leadership that other congregation members could admire and emulate in their own family relationships. During my final semester of high school, I began making plans to attend community college, despite my father's preference that I enter full-time pioneer service immediately after graduation. The tension around this decision revealed another layer of the control system that governed our household, as my father framed my desire for higher education as evidence of worldly ambition and lack of appreciation for the spiritual privileges available within God's organization. My mother found herself caught between supporting my educational goals and maintaining loyalty to my father's spiritual authority, a position that required her to suppress her own hopes for my future in order to avoid appearing rebellious or unsupportive of theocratic priorities. The conversations about my college plans became another venue for my father to demonstrate his spiritual authority and my mother's required submission to his judgment. When she tentatively suggested that some additional education might help me support a future family while still maintaining my spiritual responsibilities, he corrected her for failing to trust in Jehovah's ability to provide for those who put kingdom interests first. When she mentioned practical concerns about my long-term financial security, he reminded her that such worldly worries revealed insufficient faith in God's promises to care for his faithful servants. These discussions followed the same pattern I had observed in countless other family decisions. My father would present his position as spiritually mature and scripturally sound. My mother would initially express some concerns or alternative perspectives. He would systematically dismantle her arguments while characterizing them as evidence of spiritual weakness or worldly thinking, and she would eventually capitulate while acknowledging the wisdom of his guidance and thanking him for helping her see the situation more clearly from a biblical perspective. I realized during this period that I had never witnessed a single family decision where my mother's initial perspective had been accepted or where my father had modified his position based on her input, no matter how reasonable her concerns or how practical her suggestions might have been. Every disagreement concluded with her acknowledging that his viewpoint was spiritually superior and accepting responsibility for her failure to immediately recognize the correctness of his judgment. The pattern was so consistent that I began to understand it as a fundamental feature of how our household operated, rather than the result of my mother's particular spiritual weaknesses or my father's exceptional spiritual insight. By graduation day, I'd made the difficult decision to move out of our family home to attend college, a choice that my father presented to the congregation as evidence of my spiritual immaturity and worldly influences that had corrupted my appreciation for theocratic privileges. My mother supported his public position while privately expressing pride in my academic achievements and hopes for my future success. A contradiction that captured perfectly the impossible situation she had learned to navigate in order to survive in our household while maintaining her standing within the congregation that had become the entirety of her social world and spiritual identity. Moving away from home for college provided me with the distance I needed to begin processing what I had witnessed during 18 years of living under my father's interpretation of biblical headship. but it also intensified my worry about my mother's well-being, as she faced even greater isolation without my presence as a buffer in their daily interactions. During my freshman year, our phone conversations became shorter and more stilted, filled with careful updates about congregation activities and my father's increasing responsibilities within the circuit organization, but devoid of any personal sharing or emotional connection that might have revealed her true state of mind. The transformation in my mother's voice during these calls was subtle but unmistakable to someone who had grown up listening to the gradual erosion of her natural personality under years of systematic correction and control. She spoke in measured tones that seemed designed to avoid saying anything that might be interpreted as criticism of my father or dissatisfaction with her circumstances, and she frequently redirected conversations away from her own experiences toward questions about my studies, my spiritual activities, and my plans for maintaining my relationship with Jehovah despite the worldly influences of higher education. During holiday breaks when I returned home, I observed that my mother's physical presence had become even smaller and more careful than I remembered. She moved through the house like someone navigating a minefield, anticipating my father's needs and preferences with an efficiency born of hypervigilance rather than love, speaking only when spoken to directly and offering opinions only when specifically requested to do so. The woman who had once filled our home with humming, spontaneous laughter and animated discussions about everything from gardening techniques to Bible prophecies had been replaced by someone who seemed to be holding her breath constantly, waiting for the next correction or criticism that might reveal another area where her thinking or behavior needed adjustment. The most disturbing change was in my mother's relationship with other congregation members, particularly the women who had once been her closest friends within the Kingdom Hall social structure. She had withdrawn from almost all voluntary participation in congregation activities beyond the mandatory meetings and field service requirements, claiming that she preferred to focus her energy on supporting my father's increasing responsibilities rather than pursuing what she characterized as less essential social interactions. When sisters from our congregation called or visited, she would politely deflect their invitations to spend time together, explaining that her husband needed her to be available for various theocratic duties that required her full attention and commitment. During my sophomore year, I began to understand that my mother's isolation wasn't just the result of my father's control, but had become a survival strategy she had developed to minimize opportunities for the kind of social comparison that might reveal to others how dramatically different her marriage had become from the loving partnerships that most congregation members assumed all elder families enjoyed. By limiting her interactions with other women, she could avoid situations where her unusual level of anxiety, her careful monitoring of every word she spoke, and her obvious fear of making any decision without my father's explicit approval might raise questions about the true nature of their relationship. The revelation that changed everything came during my junior year when I returned home for spring break to find my mother in the midst of what I now recognize was a severe depressive episode. She had lost significant weight, was sleeping erratically, and seemed to have developed an obsessive need to clean and reorganize the house repeatedly, as if maintaining perfect order in her physical environment might somehow create stability in the emotional chaos that was consuming her mental and spiritual well-being. My father attributed her condition to spiritual warfare and increased the frequency of their personal Bible studies, adding additional prayer sessions and encouraging her to examine her heart more carefully for hidden sins that might be making her vulnerable to demonic influence. On the third day of my visit, while my father was attending an elder meeting at the Kingdom Hall, I found my mother sitting at the kitchen table staring at a letter she had apparently been writing and rewriting for hours based on the crumpled papers scattered around her chair. She looked up at me with eyes that seemed to hold decades of accumulated pain, and for the first time in years, I saw a glimpse of the vibrant, thinking woman who had been my mother before she learned to suppress every aspect of her personality that didn't align perfectly with my father's expectations of appropriate wifely submission. "David," she said quietly, glancing toward the front door as if expecting my father to return at any moment. "I need to tell you something, but I don't know how to say it without sounding like I'm being disloyal or ungrateful for everything your father has done for our family." That, the careful disclaimer, was typical of how she had learned to preface any statement that might be interpreted as criticism. But something in her tone suggested that she was preparing to cross a boundary she had maintained for years in order to protect both of us from my father's spiritual authority and congregational consequences. What followed was the most honest conversation we had ever had about what life in our household had actually been like during my childhood and adolescence. My mother described years of walking on eggshells, never knowing which innocent comment or normal human reaction might trigger hours of spiritual counseling designed to help her understand why her thinking was prideful, worldly, or potentially dangerous to her relationship with Jehovah. She talked about the gradual erosion of her confidence in her own judgment, her growing fear of expressing any opinion that hadn't been pre-approved by my father, and her increasing sense that the religion she had once loved was being used as a weapon against her natural personality and legitimate emotional needs. "I used to have thoughts," she told me, tears streaming down her face as she spoke words she had apparently been holding inside for decades. "I used to have ideas about Bible verses, opinions about how we should handle family decisions, feelings about what would make me happy or fulfilled as a person. But every time I shared those thoughts, your father would explain why they were wrong, why they showed spiritual immaturity, why they revealed dangerous independence that could lead me away from the truth. After a while, I stopped having thoughts at all. I just started waiting for him to tell me what I should think, what I should feel, what I should want." She showed me the letter she had been working on, addressed to her sister who lived across the country and who had never become one of Jehovah's Witnesses despite years of attempts at conversion. The letter was an apology for years of limited contact, an explanation of the isolation she had experienced within our congregation despite being surrounded by people who claimed to love her as a sister in the faith, and a desperate plea for understanding about why she had allowed herself to become someone she no longer recognized when she looked in the mirror. "I wanted to be a good Christian wife," she wrote in careful handwriting that seemed to tremble with emotion. "I wanted to make Jehovah happy, to support your father's spiritual responsibilities, to be the kind of example that other sisters could look up to and admire. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself completely. I became so focused on avoiding spiritual correction, on preventing any behavior that might embarrass your father or reflect poorly on his qualifications as an elder, that I forgot there was supposed to be a person underneath all that submission and obedience." Reading those words felt like watching my mother emerge from decades of suffocation, finally acknowledging truths that had been visible to me for years, but that she had been trained to suppress in service of maintaining the appearance of spiritual contentment and marital harmony that our congregation expected from elder families. The woman who had once been curious, opinionated, and emotionally expressive had been systematically trained to view those very qualities as spiritual weaknesses that needed to be overcome rather than natural human characteristics that deserved to be respected and nurtured within a loving marriage relationship. The conversation continued for hours, with my mother describing specific incidents that had taught her to fear her own thoughts and feelings, moments when normal human reactions had been reframed as spiritual problems, requiring correction and adjustment. She talked about the baby shower controversy that I had witnessed years earlier, explaining how my father's reaction had taught her that any social interaction that didn't center exclusively on approved congregational activities was potentially dangerous to her spiritual standing and her marriage. She described countless other similar incidents where her natural personality had been gradually compressed into the narrow boundaries of what my father considered appropriate for an elder's wife. As she spoke, I began to understand that what I had witnessed growing up wasn't just the result of my father's particular personality or interpretation of biblical principles, but reflected broader patterns within our religious community that systematically discouraged women from developing autonomous thoughts, independent relationships, or personal interests that might compete with their primary roles as supportive wives and dedicated congregation members. The tragedy wasn't just what had happened to my mother individually, but how many other women in similar situations had learned to view their own psychological and emotional suffocation as evidence of spiritual growth rather than signs of psychological abuse disguised as biblical faithfulness. By the end of that conversation, something fundamental had shifted in our relationship and in my mother's understanding of her own experience. For the first time in decades, she had been able to articulate her pain without immediately apologizing for it, to acknowledge her losses without characterizing them as necessary sacrifices for spiritual growth, and to express anger about what had been done to her without feeling obligated to defend the people and institutions responsible for her suffering. The letter to her sister was mailed the next day, marking the beginning of my mother's slow journey toward reclaiming her identity and reconnecting with the person she had been before learning that love meant silence, that faith meant unquestioning obedience, and that spiritual maturity meant the complete surrender of personal autonomy in service of organizational loyalty and masculine authority disguised as divine arrangement. My dear friends, if you've stayed with me through this painful journey, I want you to know how much it means to me that you're here, listening to words I never thought I'd be brave enough to speak aloud. This story isn't just about my family. It's about countless families where love got confused with control, where faith became fear, and where silence became survival. If any part of this resonates with your own experience, please know that you're not alone, that your pain is valid, and that speaking truth about spiritual abuse isn't betrayal, it's liberation. I hope you'll share your own stories in the comments below, because together we can break the silence that protects systems of control and create communities where authentic love can flourish without fear. Your courage in listening gives me courage in telling, and together we're proving that the truth really can set us free.